Welcome to the stretch of ocean where compasses spin, radios whisper into static, and planes vanish mid-sentence. They call it the Bermuda Triangle, a place that swallows steel silence and certainty alike. December 1945. The Atlantic sky glows pale over Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 5 Navy bombers rise into the light engines, steady pilots, young fearless. None of them will return. For centuries, sailors and scientists alike have drawn lines across this patch of sea between Bermuda, Miami, and Puerto Rico, searching for an answer that never comes. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening, because tonight time itself might just lose its way. December 5th, 1945. A warm afternoon over the Atlantic. Static crackles through the radio room at Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station, faint, distant, and broken. We can't see land. Everything looks strange. We can't be sure where we are. It was 3:45 p.m. when the signal came through, carried on a thin wire of fear that stretched across the open ocean. 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, call sign Flight 19, were somewhere east of Florida, somewhere between the known world and the unknown. 14 men, 5 planes, no trace ever found. The sea was calm that day, the air clear. The compasses, however, were not. Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, the flight's instructor and a veteran of combat in the Pacific, was leading his men through a routine training mission, a simple navigational exercise. Drop practice bombs over Hen and Chicken Shoal near the Bahamas, then return to base before dusk. But something invisible, unseen, unmeasurable interfered. When Taylor turned north to begin the return leg, the compasses on his panel began to spin. One clockwise, the other counter. He radioed in his voice steady but uncertain. "Both my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, but everything looks wrong." On land, the control tower operator pressed his headset tighter, thinking the signal would fade back in, thinking Taylor would correct course. Instead, the ocean absorbed his words, and the silence grew heavier. Hours later, a rescue plane, a PBM Mariner, was sent to search for them. 19 more men aboard. Within 20 minutes of takeoff, it vanished from radar. A flash on the horizon, then nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no survivors. That night, the Atlantic was an endless mirror. The stars hung still, reflecting against the water like unblinking eyes. Radio operators kept their channels open long after midnight, hoping to catch a whisper, a tap, a sign of life. None came. Official Navy reports would later describe it in cold mechanical terms. Aircraft lost during training mission. Cause unknown. No evidence of malfunction. Presumed crashed at sea. But for the men who stayed behind, the families, the wives, the children who stood by the docks, it wasn't a report, it was a haunting. One wife years later said she could still hear the sound of her husband's propellers overhead every December evening around dusk, like a memory looping through the clouds. Fishermen in the Bahamas told of seeing strange formations of lights under the water patterns moving as if in flight. And the old-timers in Key West began to whisper the same line they'd used for decades, long before 1945. The sea keeps what it takes. Long before Flight 19 vanished, sailors feared this stretch of ocean. It's a vast triangle, Bermuda to the north, Miami to the west, Puerto Rico to the south. A patch of sea that seems alive, breathing in ships, spitting out myths. Christopher Columbus wrote of it in his logbook in 1492. The compass swerved wildly, he noted, and a strange light moved along the horizon. He didn't tell his crew. He knew better than to speak of omens at sea. By the 20th century, it had a name, the Bermuda Triangle, and a reputation that would echo through every port bar, every naval hangar, every tabloid headline that needed a ghost. Planes, ships, yachts, submarines, gone without a trace. No mayday, no debris, just coordinates and silence. Yet in between the folklore and the fact lies something else, something colder. Records show this region holds some of the strongest oceanic currents in the world. The Gulf Stream can move debris hundreds of miles overnight. Magnetic anomalies shift the compass by degrees invisible to the human eye. And sudden weather fronts, thin walls of fog or squalls, can descend in minutes, erasing the horizon. Still, no calculation explains how 5 aircraft, each with fuel radios and redundancy, could vanish simultaneously without one distress flare or sighting. No science explains why the search plane too disappeared in the same sky within the hour. That's why the legend persists, because the data ends and the silence begins. In the decades that followed, dozens more accounts would surface. pilots reporting ghost lights in their periphery compasses spinning wildly before steadying again, sudden whiteouts that seemed to open and close like a curtain. Some described the feeling of falling upward, a loss of gravity of orientation. Others just a blank gap in time. They called it the sea's memory, the devil's gate, the horizon that lies. And yet there were survivors too. A few who veered off course caught by luck or instinct and returned pale and shaking, unable to describe what had happened. One of them, years later, told a journalist, "It's not the sea that gets you, it's the silence. You fly into it and it takes your sound away." That silence hangs still over the coordinates of Flight 19, 25 degrees north, 77 west, the last point ever recorded. The Navy searched for 5 days, hundreds of square miles, no trace. When they gave up, they left only one note in the file. We are not even able to make a good guess as to what happened. But the folklore filled the gaps where the facts refused. Stories spread of distorted radio echoes, strange magnetic fields, phantom squadrons seen at dawn. Some said Flight 19 was pulled through a rip in time. Others that they became part of the ocean's rhythm, flying endlessly beneath the waves. In 1991, divers near Fort Lauderdale claimed to find the wreck of a TBM Avenger intact, its fuselage resting upright on the seabed. But when Navy analysts checked the serial numbers, none matched Flight 19. Another dead end, another echo. And so nearly 80 years later, the story remains suspended halfway between physics and myth, reality and reflection. 5 planes, 14 men, 1 ocean that refuses to speak. Perhaps the compass wasn't broken at all. Perhaps it was pointing towards something we still don't understand. December 1945. The war had been over for only 4 months, but the world still smelled of gunpowder. Across the airfields of Florida, young men who had once flown over Iwo Jima and the Coral Sea now practiced precision flying beneath a sun that felt strangely unfamiliar, too bright, too clean, as if the violence of the last years had never happened. Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station was one of those places caught between war and peace, a transit zone for restless ghosts. It had been built in 1942, part of a vast wartime expansion of America's naval flight program. Rows of hangars baked in the afternoon heat, fuel drums lined the tarmac, the smell of salt mixed with oil. Inside, everything hummed with the same uneasy order. Pilots, flight crews, instructors, all young, all efficient, all waiting for a new mission that never seemed to come. The war was over, but the sky was not quiet. Each morning, training planes rose and fell like a slow heartbeat over the Atlantic, tracing invisible routes across the sea, lessons in navigation discipline and survival. They called it Navigation Problem Number 1. At 2:10 p.m. on December 5, 1945, Flight 19 prepared for takeoff from runway 9L. 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, rugged, heavy, designed for the Pacific, lined up one after another, gleaming in the sun. The mission plan was simple: fly east from Fort Lauderdale to the Bahamas, drop practice bombs at a shoal turn north, then back west to base. 2 hours. Routine. They were young, most barely 20. Their instructor, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, was 30 years old, a veteran who had survived enemy fire more than once. But his hands trembled slightly that morning, and one mechanic later said his eyes looked distant, like he was already thinking somewhere far away. The last man to speak to Taylor before the flight was a control tower officer named Powers. He noted that Taylor appeared hesitant, scanning his maps again and again. When Powers asked if everything was all right, Taylor replied quietly, "Yeah, just hope these compasses don't start acting up." Outside, the wind was calm. The Atlantic glittered like broken glass. At 2:30 p.m., Flight 19 lifted off the runway one by one, engines roaring, wheels tucking in, the sound of propellers fading into the open sky. The base logs that moment as departure confirmed 14:30 hours. A few mechanics watched them disappear eastward into a horizon already fading with haze. Hours later, those same men would stand at the edge of the runway again, waiting for a sound that never came back. The Bermuda sector was always difficult for navigators. Its magnetic fields drifted unpredictably, sometimes as much as 10 degrees in a single day. Compasses misbehaved, radios echoed, storms could form out of nothing. Pilots whispered that the sky there had moods, as if it wanted to be left alone. The area where Flight 19 flew was known as Hen and Chicken's Shoal, a shallow region north of the Bahamas, where the sea floor rose suddenly, confusing radar and depth sensors. Locals called it the drowning ground. The Avenger bombers themselves were reliable but temperamental. Their electrical systems were delicate, and the long-range radios powerful but unstable, often picked up phantom signals. During the war, crews had joked that the Atlantic's static sometimes talked back. In training manuals, the Navy called it ionospheric interference. But among pilots, it was just the whisper. Lieutenant Taylor had been transferred to Fort Lauderdale only the week before. He had flown in the Pacific, not the Atlantic, and though his record was solid, he had never navigated the Florida-Bahamas corridor before. His squadron that day included Ensign George Paonessa, Ensign Joseph Bossy, Ensign George Devlin, and Ensign Robert Gerber, all recently returned from wartime deployments. Some were veterans, others were barely trained cadets. The men trusted Taylor, they always did. That morning as they ran through checklists, one mechanic noticed Taylor pacing near his aircraft. He kept looking at the horizon, he later said, as if trying to find something that wasn't there. When they took off, the world was calm. The Navy's logs described clear visibility for miles, no storm fronts, no unusual barometric pressure. But at exactly 3:10 p.m., as the planes turned northeast toward their practice zone, the first signs of trouble appeared on the radio. Static, then silence. Then Taylor's voice, distant, fragmented, confused. "This is Taylor. Both my compasses are out. I think we must have gotten lost after the last turn." Control tower operators checked their instruments. Everything on their end was normal. The operator asked for coordinates, but Taylor couldn't give them. The sea beneath him looked wrong. The islands below didn't match his maps. "We can't tell where we are. Nothing looks right." At the same time, another training squadron returning to base reported seeing something odd, 5 planes flying north too high off course. They blinked their signal lights, but there was no response. The radar trace lasted only a few seconds before it disappeared into static. By 4:30 p.m., Fort Lauderdale's watch officer had begun organizing a search. At 5:00, the sun began to sink. At 5:22, a final transmission crackled through. "We'll have to ditch soon. When the first plane goes down, we all go down together." That was the last voice they ever heard. By nightfall, the Atlantic was still. Rescue planes took off at 7:00 p.m., among them the PBM Mariner, a massive seaplane known to leak fuel vapors. 20 minutes later, a ship near the Florida coast reported a sudden flash of fire in the distance, a column of smoke rising briefly before vanishing. The Navy assumed the Mariner had exploded mid-air. No debris, no bodies, no explanation. In the morning, they widened the search grid, 200,000 square miles of ocean from Miami to Nassau, from Bermuda down to Cuba. Dozens of ships, hundreds of men, and 5 full days. They found only water. The Navy's final report typed in stiff black ink ends with one line. "It is as if they had flown to Mars." Afterward, Fort Lauderdale went back to its routines. New squadrons, new missions, new mornings. But something had changed. Pilots avoided discussing Flight 19, as if saying the number aloud would tempt the same fate. The mechanics swore they heard engines at night, faint rhythmic circling above the hangars before fading back to the sea. One radio operator refused to work the evening shift ever again, claiming that at 6:04 p.m. every day for a week his headset filled with static. Then a voice. "We're not lost, but nothing looks right." No one could prove it, no one tried. By early 1946, journalists had already begun to call it the mystery of the Vanishing Squadron. In the public mind, it became the first major ghost story of the atomic age, an omen, perhaps, that even in peace, mankind could not escape the unknown. And yet beneath the headlines and whispers, one thing remained coldly real. 5 planes, 14 men, no trace, the Atlantic stretching forever smooth as glass. Even today, Fort Lauderdale's old runway lights still flicker at night, low blue and distant. Locals say that sometimes when the wind shifts from the east, you can hear the faint hum of propellers, as if the squadron is still circling, waiting for a sky that will never clear. In the months that followed the disappearance of Flight 19, the U.S. Navy assembled a board of inquiry, its mandate simple: determine the cause of one of the most singular disappearances in aviation history. The investigation began on December 8, 1945, in a small administrative building at Naval Air Station, Miami. The transcript of those hearings still exists, typed on yellowed carbon paper stamped "Confidential." The first line reads, "Subject 5 TBM Avenger aircraft missing, presumed lost at sea. Fate unknown." Witnesses were called. Mechanics, radio operators, weather officers, flight instructors, each repeating the same phrase: the weather was good. The equipment checked out. No one, it seemed, could find the ghost in the machine. One radio technician testified that all 5 planes had been inspected that morning. Magnetos, fuel valves, and navigation compasses each tested and signed off. Another added that Lieutenant Taylor's aircraft had no known defects when it left the ground. And yet, by the record's own admission, both of Taylor's compasses failed within the first hour of flight. The inquiry noted, "It is not clear whether this is an instrument malfunction or navigational disorientation caused by magnetic deviation over the area." There is no known meteorological condition which would cause radio interference of this nature. No SOS or Mayday call was ever recorded. Each page ends with the same notation typed in precise Navy language: mysterious occurrence. Further analysis pending. On December 10th, the search was officially suspended. The commanding officer's report summarized the event as unprecedented in peacetime operations. The disappearance of Flight 19 remains without parallel or precedent. No aircraft or personnel have been recovered. It is as though they vanished into another dimension of existence. That final sentence, though poetic, was quickly redacted in later printings. The surviving carbon copy bears a heavy black line through it, yet the words still bleed faintly through the paper. It was in every bureaucratic sense a mystery that refused to be filed. By January 1946, the press had seized the story. The Miami Herald ran the headline, "Navy planes vanish in strange flight, no trace found in sea search." The article quoted an unnamed officer. There is no logical explanation. The ocean simply did not return them. The Associated Press wire service followed with its own variation. 5 torpedo bombers vanish, search plane also missing, possible magnetic storm suggested. Across the country, newspapers began to weave fact with speculation. The Chicago Tribune wrote of an invisible force. The Boston Globe printed a map showing the Triangle of Death. None of those papers used the term Bermuda Triangle, not yet. That name would come decades later, but the myth was already forming brick by brick, word by word. In Washington, the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence issued a statement meant to calm the public. The incident is under review. While unusual, the rate of disappearance is not inconsistent with standard naval aviation risk. But internally, the tone was different. Memos circulated between departments noting unexplained instrument failure and simultaneous radio blackout. One classified memorandum, later declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, reads, "This office cannot exclude the possibility of environmental magnetic distortion of significant magnitude. Recommend further study of the area known as Sector 9." Sector 9 was the Navy's internal designation for the triangular zone between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The name had no mythic intention, it was merely cartographic, but to later generations it would become synonymous with something darker. Then there were the personal records, the kind that never make it into official archives. In early 1946, Lieutenant Taylor's mother received a letter from the Navy Department. It was brief, formal, and final. "We regret to inform you that your son, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, is missing and presumed dead. His service was exemplary, his fate unknown." Weeks later, she wrote her own letter, this one to the Miami Herald. It was never published, but the draft was found decades later in a family trunk. "They tell me my boy got lost," she wrote, "but I know Charles. He could find his way through a storm blindfolded. Something out there took them, something more than wind or water." Another letter surfaced years later from Ensign Paonessa's younger brother who had joined the Navy after the incident. His note to a friend in 1947 reads, "They said they found no wreckage, but how can 5 planes vanish? I think the sea swallowed them whole like a living thing." The investigators found no evidence of weather anomalies, no reports of enemy action, and no mechanical faults shared among the aircraft. One meteorologist did mention a brief localized squall near the Bahamas that afternoon, a transient cell he called it, lasting no more than 10 minutes. The inquiry noted it, but dismissed it as irrelevant. Still, one detail refused to vanish: the radio transmission. At exactly 4:25 p.m., multiple operators logged a strange echo in Taylor's voice, as if his words were being repeated, delayed by several seconds. "FT, FT, this is FT. We can't find West. Everything looks wrong." The repetition led some technicians to believe the signal had bounced off the ionosphere, something known to happen in rare conditions, but the delay was longer than physics allowed. When the board asked for the exact coordinates of the transmission, the record shows a blank space, no entry. In the typed transcript, an officer wrote in pencil beside it, "Signal does not triangulate. Possible phantom echo." That phrase, phantom echo, would later become a kind of curse among radio operators who manned the Atlantic frequencies. Some swore that on calm nights when the static was thick, they could still catch fragments of it. A voice that said, "We're not lost. We just can't find West." In March 1946, the final report was filed. The official conclusion read, "Cause undetermined. Probable navigational error compounded by instrument malfunction. No evidence of sabotage or foul play. Nature of disappearance singular." It was the word singular that unsettled the press the most. In bureaucratic language, it meant unique. In the human imagination, it meant impossible. Lloyd's of London, the great maritime insurer, quietly conducted its own review that same year. After examining loss records from the previous decade, their analysts concluded that the Atlantic sector between Bermuda and Miami did not show a statistically higher rate of disappearance than any other busy shipping corridor. The ocean, it seemed, was as indifferent there as anywhere else. And yet, the legend refused to sink. By 1950, writer Edward Jones published a piece in the Miami Herald titled Sea Mystery at Our Back Door. He was the first to link Flight 19 to a patterned ships, yachts, and aircraft that had vanished in similar coordinates. 2 years later, George Dex Sand followed with the deadly Bermuda Triangle in Fate magazine. From then on, the term was set in ink. But in 1945, in those first months of silence, it was still just a case file, 37 pages of missing time. Page 34 bears the final note typed in thin navy font. No wreckage, no oil, no flotsam, no trace. This remains an open case. Stamped below it in faded blue, fate unknown. The archive room where that file rests is kept at a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit low humidity. The pages are brittle now, but the ink still clings like salt to metal. And when you read it aloud, when you trace the names with your finger, it's hard not to feel that something lingers between the words, an echo that was never meant to fade. In the months after the disappearance, the wives of the men from Flight 19 began to gather at the edge of the airfield at Fort Lauderdale. Every evening, just before sunset, they stood by the wire fence and looked east, out toward the invisible horizon. The sound of engines from training flights still circled above them, a cruel reminder that the sky had not stopped. But the air, they said, felt different, heavier, watching. Local residents began to notice strange things in those weeks' radios that crackled with ghost signal static that pulsed in rhythmic bursts. A fisherman from Pompano Beach reported hearing airplane motors humming beneath the water. His account dismissed by the Navy spread among the coastal towns. Folklore grows like coral from fragments of grief, salt, and speculation. And soon the story of Flight 19 no longer belonged to the military. It belonged to the sea. In taverns along the Florida coast, sailors spoke of the dead zone, a stretch of ocean that pulled compasses sideways and made clocks lose minutes. Old Bahamian fishermen had their own name for it, El Triángulo del Diablo, the Devil's Triangle. They said that on certain nights when the moon was low and red, the sea became glass, and one could see deep below faint lights moving in formation like aircraft submerged but still flying. One story told of a diver near Bimini in the early 1950s who swore he found the fuselage of a plane intact, upright, its cockpit sealed. When he returned the next day with his crew, the wreck was gone, the sand smooth as if nothing had ever rested there. Others whispered about time folds, invisible seams where seconds stretched and folded back upon themselves. A radio operator who had once served at the Fort Lauderdale station claimed that 10 years after the incident, he heard a transmission come through his receiver late one December night. FT, this is FT, we can't find West. He said the voice sounded like Taylor's clear, exhausted human, but when he checked the frequency, it was empty. No aircraft, no atmospheric skip, no explanation. He never told his superiors. Instead, he wrote it down in a notebook, a record of phantom traffic. In the Bahamas, the locals tell a story of the Ghost Squadron. They say that on clear nights just before storms roll in, 5 lights appear over the horizon, moving in tight formation. Fishermen who see them turn their boats toward home. If you watch too long, one said, you'll follow them and never come back. The older generations in Key Largo claim the sea there is hungry, that it remembers the metal, the fuel, the heat of war. They throw offerings into the waves, a coin, a drop of rum, a lock of hair to appease the restless spirits of the lost. It is said that on the anniversary of Flight 19's disappearance, the tide retreats farther than usual, as if the sea itself takes a breath. But perhaps the strangest tale comes from a man named Richard Jenkins, a maintenance worker at the air station in the 1960s. He was on night watch when at 2:00 a.m. he saw the runway lights flicker, then heard the unmistakable sound of 5 propellers approaching from the east. He ran outside. The sound grew louder, circling overhead, but there was nothing visible, no shape, no shadow, just wind. Then as quickly as it came, it was gone. He filed a report, but it was never logged. Years later, he told a local journalist, maybe it's a recording, the sky replaying what it remembers. Folklorists call this kind of story a residual haunting when trauma imprints itself onto a place, repeating endlessly like a broken reel of film. But for those who lived near the sea, it wasn't theory. It was presence. In Bimini, there's an island myth older than Flight 19 that the ocean there hides a gateway, a blue hole that connects to another realm. Divers in the 1930s described hearing voices inside those caverns, a low, distant humming. After 1945, they began calling it the Doorway of the Five. One local priest, Father Ortega, refused to perform blessings near that part of the coast. He told a newspaper reporter in 1956, "The water there listens. You can feel it watching you." Archaeologists dismissed it as superstition, but when they lowered recording equipment into one of the deep sinkholes near Andros Island, they captured faint rhythmic sounds, a pulsing that repeated at 12-second intervals. The scientists labeled it hydroacoustic interference. The locals said it was the heartbeat of the lost squadron. Some families of the Flight 19 crew members reported dreams that came in cycles recurring every December. One widow wrote in her diary, "I see him in the dream, standing in uniform, wet but smiling. He says he's not cold. He says they're still flying." Another, decades later, told her grandson that sometimes the smell of aviation fuel filled the kitchen right before a storm. She'd whisper, "They're passing through again." The ocean, after all, has always been a theater of ghosts. In the folklore of sailors, the dead don't rest, they drift. And in the years after Flight 19, the Atlantic seemed to breathe them back into every story that touched its shore. Scientists and skeptics would argue, of course, speaking of magnetic declination, methane eruptions, rogue waves, but none of those explanations ever quieted the whisper in local memory, because science can account for disappearance, but not for repetition. In 1963, a Coast Guard crew on routine patrol near Grand Bahama reported seeing a formation of lights hovering above the water. They described them as amber arranged in a shallow V. The sighting lasted 30 seconds, then vanished into darkness. The official report listed it as unexplained aerial illumination. Privately, one officer scrawled in the margin, "Could be them." By the 1970s, the legend had already fossilized into folklore. Magazines printed ghost stories disguised as journalism. Tourists visited triangle-themed attractions holding compasses that spun in circles, though none could say if the movement was real or mechanical trickery. And somewhere in the noise of pop culture, the voices of the real men, Taylor Bossy, Devlin Gerber, Payonessa, faded into archetypes. But for their families, the haunting never ended. Each December, the surviving relatives still gathered near Fort Lauderdale Beach, lighting candles in a line that pointed east. At 6:04 p.m., the time of the last transmission, they'd listen in silence. Some swore they heard something, a faint hum, the whisper of wind, a word half-spoken. Even now, decades later, divers and sailors carry the story like a superstition. They tap the hull 3 times before setting off once for each lost plane that was never found, twice for the ones still searching. It's not religion, it's remembrance. A Bahamian proverb says, "The sea is a mouth that never closes." And in the folklore that trails Flight 19, that mouth still murmurs. If you stand on the beach at Fort Lauderdale on a quiet evening when the tide is low and the air heavy with salt, you can sometimes hear the rhythm of engines beneath the wind. 5 of them, moving together, holding formation. And for a moment you almost believe they're still out there circling in a sky that never ends, caught between the living and the lost. By the time the story of Flight 19 had settled into the archives, the world had already moved on, or tried to. The 1950s came with new wars, new technologies, and new skies to conquer. Yet beneath the clean geometry of radar grids and shipping routes, the same pattern pulsed, a quiet recurrence hidden in reports stamped classified or no further action. Because Flight 19 had not been the first to vanish over that stretch of sea, and it would not be the last. In March of 1918, nearly 3 decades before the Avengers squadron disappeared, the U.S. Navy cargo ship USS Cyclops left Barbados bound for Baltimore. It carried 309 men, sailors, engineers, and Marines, and a load of manganese ore for wartime steel production. The weather was fair, the sea calm. She never arrived. No distress signal, no debris, no survivors. The Cyclops was the Navy's single greatest non-combat loss of life, and it happened squarely inside the same triangular zone. The report filed in April 1918 used the same phrase that would appear again and again in later decades. "Ship overdue, fate unknown." The commanding officer of the Caribbean Fleet wrote, "No theory can account for her total disappearance. It is as though she evaporated." The ocean had already rehearsed the act long before Flight 19 followed. 2 decades later, in 1941, the Proteus and Nereus sister ships to the Cyclops were converted for cargo service. Both vanished under separate commands, same route, same waters, same silence. The Navy, unwilling to repeat the words "fate unknown," simply listed them as lost with all hands. In the corridors of the Bureau of Ships, officers began referring to that region as the Graveyard Lane. Some whispered that the Atlantic there carried an electrical pulse, a residual current from something ancient below. Others, quieter superstitious, said it was haunted by the weight of men who died in silence, still trapped in their machines beneath the silt. By the 1960s, commercial flight had turned the triangle into a corridor of international air traffic. Planes crossed it daily, hour by hour. Most passed unremarkably, but every few years a pattern broke through the calm. On February 2, 1963, the tanker Marine Sulphur Queen bound for Norfolk vanished with 39 men aboard. The Coast Guard found only a single life vest floating alone, unburned, unbitten by sharks. The official report concluded, "Vessel disappeared under unknown circumstances, presumed total loss." Later that same decade, two British passenger aircraft, Star Tiger 1948 and Star Ariel 1949, vanished in clear weather en route to Bermuda. Their radio logs ended mid-sentence. The word overdue became a graveyard shorthand for the impossible. A recurring note in those investigations appears again and again: compass deviations, static interference, sudden weather distortion, crews describing a wall of cloud that wasn't there moments before. In one of the British air transport reports, a single handwritten line appears in the margin, likely by an investigator too weary to file it formally. Same conditions as the Americans in 45. The same conditions, the same silence, the same sea. By the 1970s, the accumulation of disappearances could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Statisticians at Lloyd's of London revisited their wartime archives and confirmed what they had concluded decades earlier: the loss rate was not higher than other heavily trafficked seas. Yet they could not explain why so many of the disappearances in this one region shared identical details. Last transmission at 6:04 p.m., no debris located, compass unreliable, fate unknown. Each case folded over the next like pages in a repeating book. Researchers began calling it the pattern of silence. It stretched across time from the Cyclops to Flight 19 to the Star Ariel and beyond, a shape invisible to the eye but etched into history. In 1973, the U.S. Coast Guard conducted an extensive review of all reports filed within the Bermuda sector. The study was blunt, scientific, unromantic. It concluded that every incident could be explained by a combination of navigational error, human fatigue, and environmental conditions: magnetic variance, methane eruptions, microbursts, rogue waves. A clean report, a rational world. But within the same year, a classified Navy memorandum circulated quietly under the heading Sector Anomalies Atlantic Test Range. Declassified decades later, it revealed radar irregularities, pulses detected by experimental monitoring systems at intervals of exactly 19 years. The memo referred to them as periodic distortions of unknown origin. One line circled in pencil reads, "Pattern consistent with magnetic resonance field at 25 to 77 degrees coordinates of Flight 19. Was it coincidence, instrument error, or something cyclic, as if the sea itself moved according to a hidden clock?" That same year, oceanographer Dr. Benjamin Larkin led a sonar survey near the Bahama Bank Trench. At a depth of 4,500 feet, his team recorded an anomaly, a rectangular formation partially buried in silt roughly the dimensions of a World War II aircraft wing. But when they returned a month later, the formation was gone. In his log, Larkin wrote a single line: "Structure no longer present. Ocean floor disturbed as if shifted overnight." His findings were never published in peer-reviewed journals. Funding was withdrawn. His assistant later told a reporter that Larkin became obsessed with the idea of resonant disappearance, that certain frequencies of sound or electromagnetic flux could erase matter itself the way static erases a recording. He died in 1979, found near his lab notebooks. On the first page, underlined twice, was a sentence: "Every 40 years, the triangle calls back what it lost. Patterns cross more than geography. They cross time." In 1968, near Okinawa, a squadron of U.S. Navy patrol planes encountered a compass failure and disorientation that lasted precisely 15 minutes. Their radio operator recorded that the aircraft passed through a gray haze. Instruments froze. When the haze lifted, their clocks had jumped forward 10 minutes. The coordinates 26 degrees 128 degrees, the opposite side of the globe. Later analysts noted it lay at nearly the same latitude as the Bermuda Triangle. And so the motif spread two oceans, one phenomenon. From the Caribbean to the Pacific, the same whispers surfaced: ghost transmissions, radar echoes, time gaps, ships adrift without crew. Perhaps, as one admiral once said off-record, the Earth itself has memory, and certain places replay it. The 1980s brought new eyes, satellites, submersibles, and digital records. Technology should have dispelled superstition, yet the data only deepened the fog. Weather satellites recorded cloud formations that appeared and vanished in under 30 seconds, too fast to be natural. Naval sonar picked up metallic signatures that shifted positions between scans. A research drone sent to investigate lost contact 7 minutes after entering the same grid. The logbook entry drone signal terminated at 6:04 p.m. Always that time, always that silence. When the U.S. Geological Survey reviewed the recordings years later, they found electromagnetic fluctuations peaking precisely every December, the month of Flight 19's last mission. Coincidence, they said. The ocean disagreed. Some modern theorists, reaching beyond science, speak of acoustic gravity waves, deep-sea sound pulses that bend time at microscopic levels. Others reach further still to myths of Atlantis ley lines or portals of energy. But between the extremes, data and dream, remains the same pattern, a recurring disappearance repeating like a breath. Every century has its ghosts. In the 18th century, sailors feared the Sargasso Sea, a mirror of still water where ships drifted, their crews skeletal at the helm. In the 19th, it was the Mary Celeste found adrift, sails set, crew gone. In the 20th, it was Flight 19. Each era invents a new name for the same silence. And perhaps that is the true pattern, not magnetic storms or wormholes, but the human need to explain the void, to map the unknown into myth, to say it vanished here rather than admit we do not know where the world ends. In the classified annex of the National Archives, a thin folder labeled Continuing Observations. Atlantic Sector still exists. Its final entry, dated December 5, 1995, exactly 50 years to the day after Flight 19, vanished, notes the detection of an unregistered radar signature moving north from the Bahamas at 180 knots, low altitude, no transponder, visual confirmation none, interception none, signal terminated 6:04 p.m. No report followed, no investigation opened. The annotation at the bottom is brief, handwritten in blue pencil. Pattern repeats. Recommend silence. The case of Flight 19 did not end in 1945. It became a template and echo that each generation rediscovers. From the Cyclops to the Star Ariel to the Marine Sulphur Queen to the unidentified radar contact half a century later. Always the same triangle. Always the same hour. The ocean in different yet precise marking time by disappearance. Perhaps the true coordinates are not on any map, but in the rhythm itself. The heartbeat of the sea, the silence between the signals, the ghost line where history repeats itself over and over again. There is a locked cabinet in the Naval Archives, Washington, D.C. The folder inside bears no official case number, only a faded label, FLT-19, secondary materials non-indexed. When the archivist opens it, the smell of salt still lingers on the paper. Inside are fragments, a torn flight log, a reel of magnetic tape, 3 photographs that should not exist, and 1 notebook so water-stained the ink has bled into blue ghosts. It begins with a photograph, dated December 6, 1945, 0700 hours. The picture shows a line of 5 TBM Avengers on the runway at Fort Lauderdale, but experts say the exposure was taken long after the disappearance. The planes are the same models, the same call signs, even the same serial markings. But the shadows on the tarmac show the sun setting, not rising. The film type didn't exist until 1948. The Navy denied the photo's authenticity, yet the negative bears an official supply code and a signature Taylor CC. For years it was dismissed as a prank or double exposure, but when forensic analysts re-examined it in 1989, they found salt crystals embedded in the emulsion identical to those found on wreckage retrieved from deep-sea pressure. How did seawater end up on film allegedly shot on land? No one could answer. Then came the Mariner tape. The PBM rescue aircraft that vanished the same night as Flight 19 had been equipped with an experimental wire recorder, a prototype meant to log radio transmissions automatically. When the wreckage of a PBM wingtip was discovered in 1963 off the Florida coast, divers also recovered a sealed steel box. Inside, a reel of tape, corroded but intact. The Navy's transcription team attempted to play it in 1964. Halfway through, the playback system malfunctioned. The room filled with static, then a voice, faint, distorted, distant. "We're not the C2 Bright Compass, stop." The voice did not match the Mariner crew, it matched Taylor's. The tape was classified anomalous audio, do not duplicate. Shortly afterward, it disappeared from the evidence vault. When the archive was inventoried in 1972, the box was gone. The only record left is a carbon copy of the playback transcript ending mid-sentence. Sound terminated abruptly. Personnel present report. Sensation of vibration in floor. Tape jammed, heat increase noted. One technician who witnessed it later told his wife that the room hummed like a power line, and that for days after he couldn't shake the feeling that he was hearing the ocean from inside. There is another clue, one that was hidden in plain sight. In the National Weather Service vault in Miami, a declassified folder labeled Meteorological Logs Deck 1945 contains a page misfiled between routine weather charts. It is a log entry written by a station officer at Andros Island. Unusual cloud formation observed 1730 hours. Appears circular. Lightning within cloud silent. Duration 5 minutes. At 1735, cloud dissipated instantly. No storm was recorded anywhere else that day. The coordinates on the report, 25° and 7770, are the exact last known position of Flight 19. When meteorologists reviewed the report decades later, they noted another anomaly, the handwriting. It matched that of Lieutenant Harold Jenkins, an officer who died in 1943, 2 years before the report was written. Perhaps the strangest discovery surfaced not from an archive, but from a private collection. In 1997, a retired Navy mechanic named Samuel Greaves auctioned a box of memorabilia from his service years. Inside was a leather-bound notebook labeled Taylor Personal Notes. Historians assumed it a forgery until a handwriting analysis matched samples from Taylor's wartime correspondence. The entries begin on November 28, 1945, 1 week before the flight. He writes of compass errors again today, east deviation, then north. Then a line underlined twice. The horizon feels wrong. The ocean looks like it's breathing. The final entry, dated December 4, 1945, 2350, reads, tested both compasses after dark. They point true only when lights are off. When cockpit lights on, they drift east. Not magnetic, something else. Tomorrow we fly. After the notebook's authenticity was confirmed, the Navy requested it be surrendered for preservation. Greaves complied. A week later, he reported that the officials who collected it never signed his release form. When he contacted the National Archives, there was no record of any retrieval. The notebook vanished a second time. A letter surfaced later, undated, unsigned, written in typewriter font, identical to the inquiry correspondence of 1946. It reads, all tests indicate local magnetic flux variation at coordinates identical to Flight 19's last transmission. Secondary anomalies recorded in 1964 and 1983 show temporal consistency. It is not merely a magnetic deviation, it behaves like an event repeating. At the bottom of the page, a single phrase in pencil, 6:04 p.m. every time. But the most haunting testimony came from a man who swore he saw what no one else did. His name was Henry Parsons, a radio man, aboard the USS Solomons, one of the search ships deployed in December 1945. He wrote a personal account in his journal, sealed it, and left instructions that it not be opened until his death. When he passed in 1992, his daughter delivered it to a historian. The writing inside was steady, precise, unshaken. Night fell fast, sea calm. At 1900 hours, radar showed a formation north-northeast. 5 returns tight pattern, 1,500 feet altitude. We signaled, no response. Then one by one the blips faded like lights going out in fog. Before the last vanished, there was a shimmer on the water phosphorescence, bright green. Then it was gone. The men with me said nothing. We all saw it. He ends the account with 4 words. We found nothing alive. The Navy never released Parsons's radar logs. They claimed no such record existed, but his journal includes the serial number of the radar screen AN-APS-4 number 2962, which according to decommissioning papers was destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1948. Everywhere the investigators turned, the same trail repeated evidence found, then lost. Voices heard, then erased. A pattern of appearance and disappearance that mirrored the very mystery it sought to solve. By the late 1990s, private researchers began comparing the Flight 19 case with others, the Cyclops, the Star Ariel, the Marine Sulphur Queen. Across them all, they found anomalies, missing pages in logs, destroyed instruments, photographs with reversed negatives, times of last contact frozen around twilight. One chilling discovery linked them beyond coincidence. Every disappearance recorded a final log entry or signal between 6:02 and 6:06 p.m. Some called it the window, others the hour of silence. In 2005, an oceanographic survey team using deep-sea magnetometers near the Bahamas Trench recorded a sudden power fluctuation, a pulse lasting 2.8 seconds. The equipment failed. When rebooted, the internal clock had reset itself to December 5, 1945, 1804. The data was sent to Naval Research for analysis. 3 weeks later, the hard drives were reported stolen. Insurance labeled it industrial theft. The research director simply wrote, "Or the sea took them back." There's a rumor, unverifiable, unrecorded, whispered among archivists of a final message decoded from an encrypted transmission intercepted by a weather satellite in 2014. The signal came from low altitude, roughly 80 miles northeast of Nassau, traveling at 180 knots. The audio was faint, obscured by interference, but analysts claimed to hear 5 voices overlapping, fragmented. Among them, one phrase repeated, "We see land, but it's not ours." The timestamp on the file, 06:04 p.m. The digital record was later deleted due to signal contamination. No one has ever claimed official responsibility for the deletion. Somewhere between superstition and science, between magnetic flux and the ghost of radio static, the story of Flight 19 loops endlessly, a signal caught in its own reflection. The pattern has become its own witness, objects found, then erased. Evidence preserved, then burned. Echoes recorded, then silenced. And perhaps that is why the legend never fades. Because the investigation into Flight 19 does not end with answers, it ends with vanishing itself. A photograph that shouldn't exist, a notebook that disappears twice, a voice on a tape that replays half a century later, a pulse in the ocean resetting time. They are not clues. They are the rhythm of the same unknown, the repetition of an event that refuses to die. So when you look east toward the horizon that swallowed them, remember this. Every December at 6:04 p.m., the radios in South Florida still pick up a thin hum on old frequencies, a note between static like breathing. And if you listen long enough, it begins to form words. FT, this is Flight 19. Then silence, always silence. Morning over the Atlantic. The water lies smooth as metal, an endless sheet of silver. The coordinates 25 degrees north, 77 degrees west. Look empty now. No signal, no sound. Only the slow heartbeat of waves against invisible wrecks. It's been 80 years. Flight 19 remains filed under cause unknown. The report sits in a drawer in the National Archives, its paper yellowing under constant light, its ink fading like the memory of a dream. A simple heading at the top. U.S. Navy training flight lost at sea. December 5, 1945. No answers, no closure. Only the arithmetic of absence. 5 planes, 14 men, and a silence that never ended. But silence is not nothing. It's what memory becomes when it runs out of words. Families of the missing were given folded flags and condolence letters typed on government stationery. Each letter used the same line, "Your son served with distinction. His fate remains unknown." They held memorials without bodies, funerals without graves. Some placed stones in the sea. Some kept the men's photographs turned toward the horizon so the eyes would always look east. Lieutenant Taylor's mother never remarried. In the final years of her life, she lived in a small apartment in Jacksonville near the beach. Neighbors remembered her as quiet, but every December she would walk to the water and throw a handful of white flowers into the surf. The petals would drift back toward her feet. She never moved until they were gone. In 1989, oceanographer David Bright organized a private expedition to search for the wrecks. He found Avengers, 3 of them scattered in shallow water, but none matched the serial numbers of Flight 19. Every identification plate, he said, was erased by time. When journalists asked if he believed the lost squadron still rested somewhere below, he answered simply, "If they're down there, they don't want to be found." Other teams came and went. The Navy private divers' television specials, each descending with sonar and camera drones, each returning with nothing but silence and static. It's as if the ocean itself had decided to keep the story for its own. The Bermuda Triangle has become an industry. Now documentaries, books, television shows, all circling the same absence like moths around a dark light. Scientists explain it through magnetism and methane. Skeptics dismiss it as coincidence. But the people who live along that coast, fishermen, sailors, airmen, still lower their voices when the subject comes up. Because out there beyond the maps, the air feels different, charged, listening. One December, a Coast Guard crew passing near the Bahamas reported a strange flicker on their radar, 5 returns moving in a loose formation heading west at low altitude. They assumed it was a mirage, a ghost echo. But when they logged the time, it was exactly 6:04 p.m. When asked about it later, the radar operator said quietly, "It looked like they were coming home." The official narrative ends with paperwork, forms, coordinates, lists of fuel loads, copies of maintenance reports. But beneath those forms lies something older, the sea's long memory. It remembers every engine that sank, every voice that faded mid-sentence, and it repeats them. In Bimini, they still tell the story of the 5 who fly forever. On calm nights when phosphorescent plankton light, the waves, old fishermen say, you can see patterns in the glow, 5 trails moving together, turning north, vanishing at once. The locals leave offerings on the shore, a cup of rum, a silver coin to keep the sea from taking new names. At Fort Lauderdale, the old runway still exists, though it's covered in weeds now. If you walk it at dusk, you can hear the hum of traffic from the new airport nearby, but underneath it faintly something else, a steady droning. 5 propellers, 1 heartbeat. Historians try to close files. Folklore keeps them open. Somewhere between them lives the truth, shifting, breathing, waiting. The legend of Flight 19 is no longer about airplanes or coordinates. It's about the space where human certainty ends, the edge of the map where the lines dissolve into blue. And maybe that's why the story endures, because everyone who hears it feels the same quiet pull, the need to know what lies beyond the horizon, and the fear that the answer might be nothing at all. In 2014, the Smithsonian opened an exhibit titled Lost Over the Atlantic. At the entrance, a recording plays the voice of a radio operator reading the last known transmission. "We can't find West. Everything looks wrong." Visitors stand still as it plays on a loop, the static filling the room like breath. Some close their eyes. Some whisper the words aloud. For a few seconds, the air feels heavy, as if something unseen has just passed through. One child asked her father, "Are they still up there?" The father hesitated, then said, "Maybe they never came down." In the final report of the Navy Board, there is a single line long overlooked, written in a footnote by an anonymous clerk. The case of Flight 19 may never be solved. The probability of survival is nil. Yet in all matters of the sea, nothing truly disappears. That line, buried under layers of ink and bureaucracy, might be the closest thing to an answer history can give. Because maybe the truth isn't that they vanished, but that they became part of the ocean's machinery, its endless hum, its rhythm of taking and returning. Maybe every compass that spins without reason, every pilot who loses time in a sudden haze, every whisper caught between static and silence is part of the same long echo. At 6:04 p.m. every December 5th, a group of airmen still gather near the old base at Fort Lauderdale. They stand in formation facing the east, and for 1 minute they do nothing but listen. The wind carries the smell of salt and oil, and sometimes they swear a distant vibration in the air. No one speaks, because there's nothing to say that hasn't already been said or lost. And when the minute ends, one of them always breaks the silence the same way. "Still missing, sir." The others nod. The sea answers with its usual calm. Perhaps the compasses were never broken. Perhaps they were pointing towards something we still can't name, something that waits just beyond sight, between sound and silence, a place that doesn't exist on any chart but remembers every name it's ever taken. And so the question remains, not for the Navy, not for scientists, but for us. When the world goes silent, what listens back? When a signal disappears, does it truly end, or does it keep circling, waiting to be heard? Maybe Flight 19 was never lost. Maybe it simply flew into the part of the sky that time forgot. You've just heard a file from a history that never closed. If you believe some mysteries don't fade, stay with us and listen for the next signal before it disappears too.